Major Marcus Reno's 175 soldiers did not yet know the magnitude of the storm they were walking into as they crossed the Little Bighorn River on the morning of June 25, 1876. The river was shallow, reaching only the horses' knees. They stepped onto the opposite bank. Before them lay the Native American encampment. General Custer had given them a clear order: advance, attack, raid the camp. Reno moved forward. The soldiers formed in a regular cavalry line. Rifles ready, horses covered in sweat, dust everywhere. The first 5 minutes were deceptive. A few tents came into view, a few civilians scattered. Reno's men opened fire. There was no sign of a retreat. Then the terrain changed. Thousands of warriors appeared simultaneously, as if springing from beneath the earth. Oglala Sioux, Hunkpapa Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors. The exact figures are debated, but even conservative estimates spoke of 2,000 warriors against Reno's 175 men, 1 to 12, perhaps 1 to 15. The volley fire began instantly. Reno's left flank collapsed. The warriors advanced mostly on foot, rather than on horseback, firing from the hills, the brush, and the bends of the riverbed. The Springfield Model 1873 carbines were single-shot weapons. Reloading took time. The Sioux warriors utilized that time. Every second, an American soldier fell from his horse. Reno made a decision. Holding the line was impossible. He halted the charge and went on the defensive. He pulled his men back to a wooded area, right on the riverbank. It could be defended for perhaps 10 minutes. Perhaps. Then everything shattered in a single second. The Arikara scout Bloody Knife, standing directly beside Reno, was struck by a bullet. The bullet entered the dead center of his skull, and upon exiting, it splattered brain matter, bone fragments, and blood all over Reno's face, eyes, and mouth. Reno froze. The commander himself had not been shot. He was physically intact, but mentally he was no longer there. This moment was critical, because in battle, when the commander stops, everyone stops. Reno issued an order. Then he issued another that contradicted the first. The officers looked at one another. Some dismounted. Some stayed in the saddle. The wooded area was being defended, but with every passing minute the Sioux warriors tightened the circle. Arrows pierced through the trees. Gunfire echoed from every direction. Some of Reno's soldiers began to flee without even hearing a retreat order. The chain of command had effectively collapsed. The order to retreat finally came. But what a retreat it was. The river was on the other side. The hill was beyond the river. To reach it, they first had to cross open ground, ford the river, and then climb a steep slope. They were under fire at every point. The soldiers ran. They ran haphazardly, in a panic, trampling over each other. Some horses fell in the first 50 meters. Their riders were pinned beneath them, or took a bullet while trying to stand up, where they fell. Some soldiers dropped their weapons. The Springfield carbine was heavy. It jolted while running. Some threw it away. Some threw away their packs. One soldier took off his boots to run faster. When he was shot, he was still running. The river was 20 meters wide, but those 20 meters were hell. The Sioux warriors closed in from both sides. They were firing from this side of the river and from the opposite bank. Soldiers trying to cross were shot as they entered the water. Some fell halfway across. The river ran red with blood. Horses knocked each other down in panic in the water. Riders were trapped underneath, drowned, or killed by a bullet, sometimes both simultaneously. The ballistic tables are clear. In this retreat, Reno lost 47 men in 40 minutes, 29 dead, 18 wounded, 27% of the entire force. For a cavalry unit to lose 27% of its men in less than an hour was considered an absolute disaster by the military standards of that era. The hill was in sight, a steep incline right across the river. It would later be known as Reno Hill. At that moment, it was merely the hope of survival. Those who ran climbed. Their hands and knees began to bleed. The earth was hard, dry, and full of jagged rocks. Some soldiers slipped and tumbled back down. The incoming fire from below continued. The Sioux warriors were not climbing. Not yet. They were shooting, waiting, and shooting again. The hill could be a trap for them. It was open ground, without cover, without water. The Americans were walking into it willingly. Reno stood on the hill. How many men were beside him? About 130. It was 175 at the start. Where were the rest? In the river, in the woods, on the plains. The answers varied for all of them, but their end was the same. Reno brought his hands to his face. Bloody Knife's blood was still there. It had dried. He could feel it beneath his eyelids. The commander was functional at that moment, but broken. The officers waited for an order. No order came. A lieutenant took the initiative and began setting up a defensive line. The soldiers tried to dig into the dirt with their bags, with rocks, with their bare hands. 4 miles to the south of the hill, in a valley, General George Armstrong Custer's 210 men were still on the move. At that moment, Custer didn't know. He did not know what had become of Reno. His own plan was in effect. He would flank from the northern side of the valley. Reno would strike from the south, and the camp would be split in two. That was the plan. It was beautiful on paper. The soldiers on the hill were digging. The fire was still coming. The Sioux were not pulling back. They were merely tightening the circle. Slow, patient, systematic. As if time was on their side. Because it was. Hands were bleeding on Reno Hill. Soldiers were digging, carrying rocks, dragging the bodies of dead horses to use as cover. The ground was hard, and there were no shovels. Fingernails were breaking. No one complained. Those who complained died. It was 2 p.m. The sun beat down directly from above. There was no shade. There was no water. Ammunition was dwindling. Then a dust cloud appeared, from the southeast, approaching rapidly. The soldiers raised their weapons. For a moment, they thought it might be Sioux reinforcements. Then the American flag came into view. Captain Frederick Benteen appeared on the hill with 3 cavalry companies, a total of 125 men. Reno's fate had suddenly changed, or at least it seemed so. The scene Benteen saw from the hill stopped him in his tracks. 130 men digging trenches, the wounded groaning, corpses crushed beneath horses, blood and dust everywhere. Reno ran to Benteen, his face still stained with Bloody Knife's blood, his eyes vacant. Benteen looked at him. This man's capacity to command was highly debatable, but his own order was clear. Custer had written him, "Come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs." The one who wrote it was the adjutant. The note was in his pocket. Benteen had read it, but he had not quickened his pace. This decision would later be brought before a military tribunal. For now, the 2 commanders stood in the middle of the hill, surrounded by thousands of warriors. The combined force was now 255 men. The ammunition was with Benteen's pack mules, which was good, but there was no water. The number of wounded was rising. Every minute 1 or 2 more soldiers dropped to the ground. The Sioux had changed tactics. Instead of attacking the hill directly, snipers positioned on the opposite ridges raked the trench lines. They were using Winchester Model 1873 rifles. This weapon was critical because it was a repeating rifle. The American soldier was still using the single-shot Springfield carbine. While the Sioux warriors could fire in rapid succession without reloading, the American soldier had to manually open the mechanism, eject the spent casing, and insert a new bullet after every single shot. In a trench, in a confined space, this difference was lethal. The snipers were methodical. They targeted any soldier whose head peeked above the trench. A head bobbed up, a boot slid forward. They fired right there. Some soldiers were shot just by exposing their hands. The bullets seemed to lock onto their targets as if guided by history. Benteen analyzed the situation during the first hour. He reinforced the line. Soldiers carefully positioned the bodies of dead mules and horses. The animal carcasses formed a natural barrier. They bloated, they smelled. Flies swarmed them, but they stopped the bullets. The least expensive barricade was a dead animal. Everyone learned this very quickly. The defensive line was roughly established in the shape of a horseshoe. The highest point of the hill was the center. The two flanks extended downwards, blocking the slopes overlooking the valley. Marksmen were stationed at regular intervals. The number of men assigned to each point was calculated. Who built this line? Benteen, not Reno. Reno maintained his presence throughout that afternoon, issuing orders, sometimes unnecessary ones, sometimes none at all. But Benteen had effectively assumed command. At 4 o'clock, Captain Thomas Weir moved forward. Weir was one of Custer's men. He had personal ties. 4 miles to the south, down in the valley, Custer was still fighting. Or so they thought, when the wind carried the sounds of the gunfight southward. Some soldiers on the hill could hear it. Distant, muffled, but continuous, volley fire, massed gunfire. Weir could not bear the waiting. He asked Reno for permission. Reno gave an ambiguous reply. Weir took his company and moved south. He reached a peak, a place that would later be called Weir Point. From there he looked down into the valley. There are conflicting accounts of what they saw. Some accounts say they saw smoke. Some say moving Sioux warriors. Some say a mass of horses. They couldn't clearly see where Custer's men were because the distance was 4 miles and the terrain in between was filled with dips and ridges. But the sounds were there. The sound of heavy gunfire. Weir stayed for 5 minutes. Then the Sioux warriors turned toward Weir Point. Hundreds of warriors. Weir had 40 men with him. There was no choice but to retreat. They ran back to Reno Hill. Weir's rescue attempt had lasted exactly 40 minutes. The net result was 0, but everyone on Reno Hill now knew one thing. 4 miles south, Custer was facing severe pressure, and no one on the hill was going there. As the sun set, the Sioux fire intensified. This was a tactical choice. In daylight, sniper fire was precise. At dusk, the overall pressure was increased. Simultaneous fire was unleashed upon every point along the American defensive line. Behind this coordination were the directives of Gall, Crazy Horse, and other war chiefs. 8 soldiers lost their lives on the hill during that hour. When night fell, the fire subsided. The Sioux did not launch large-scale attacks at night. It was a cultural preference, rooted in the belief that a warrior killed in the dark would not be able to find his way in the afterlife. The American soldiers were partially aware of this fact. This gave them a few hours to breathe. The digging resumed. Deeper, wider. Hands were still bleeding, still no water. The wounded were delirious from thirst. Dr. Henry Porter, under a canvas tent by candlelight, bandaged the exact same type of wound over and over again. Gunshot wounds, mostly in the upper body. The Sioux snipers had been looking down from above, making targeting easy. 4 miles south, there was no sound anymore. The firing had ceased. Nothing was coming from the valley. This either meant Custer had emerged victorious, or it meant something else entirely. The soldiers on the hill looked at one another. No one uttered a word. Morning would come, and morning would make everything clear. Throughout the night, hands never stopped moving. The soldiers dug in the dark, carried rocks, dragged the bodies of dead animals. The Sioux fire had slowed, but it hadn't stopped entirely. Occasionally a single bullet would pierce the darkness, not random, calculated. It targeted the light of a fire, a lantern, the glow of a cigarette on the hill. The soldiers stopped smoking. They stopped lighting fires. In the dark, in silence, they dug. What did Reno do that night? Testimonies conflict. Some officers say he paced between the trenches. Some say he sat motionless for hours. There is another testimony, recorded in court transcripts. Reno drank, that night, whiskey. From the medical alcohol supply brought to the front, how much he drank is debated, but the fact that he drank is not. Benteen was active all night. He checked the lines. He took an ammunition inventory. He visited the wounded. He spoke with Dr. Porter. He calculated how many men would be able to hold the line until morning. Benteen's letters describing that night were later published. He was cold, clinical, almost devoid of emotion. Our situation was grim, but under control, he wrote. Under control. 47 dead, 52 wounded, no water, rescue uncertain. Benteen's definition of under control was far from standard. At midnight, a sound came from Weir Point. The sentry gave a warning. Everyone grabbed their weapons. Silence. Then the sound again. Rolling stones. Animal or human? A few minutes passed. No answer came. No one approached that point until morning. Before dawn broke, Crazy Horse's men repositioned themselves on the southern ridges. The soldiers on the hill couldn't see this, but they heard it. The sound of horses, the sound of men, a low hum coming from a distance. Thousands of people were moving, slow but systematic. They were taking positions for the morning fire. The sun was not yet on the horizon. The Hunkpapa Chief Gall would apply pressure from the east, Oglala warriors from the north. The Cheyenne faction would seal off the south. This wasn't a plan for annihilation. This was a finishing plan. The Americans on the hill were already trapped. Now they would be systematically melted down. When the sun rose, the firing began. The morning fire was different from the night fire. It was more intense, more coordinated and closer. The Sioux warriors had shifted their positions overnight. Some groups had crept to within 100 meters of the hill. Certain points of the American line were now practically point-blank targets. In the first half hour, 7 soldiers were hit. 2 of these drops were fatal. 1 died instantly. 4 were wounded. Dr. Porter's workload surged. Bandages were running out. Porter started using pieces of shirts. There were no clean shirts. The worn ones were torn apart. Sterility in wound care was 0. Infection was inevitable. The water situation had now escalated to a state of absolute emergency. As of the morning of June 26, there was no drinkable water left on the hill. The soldiers had emptied their canteens the night before. The wounded consumed the most water. Fever, blood loss, shock. The body demanded fluids. When deprived, consciousness blurred. The temperature was rising. The little Bighorn Valley was around 38 to 40 degrees Celsius, 100 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, on June 26, 1876. There was no shade. There was no wind. The dead animal bodies were bloating. The stench spread everywhere. The flies swarmed densely for the first time that morning. They landed on the wounded. Porter tried to wave them away with his hands. It was impossible. Some soldiers began to drink their own urine. This is documented information, a detail repeated in the testimonies of survivors, in subsequent military inquiry documents, and in newspaper accounts. Soldiers on the brink of madness from thirst drank their own urine. Medically, this is a temporary fix and accelerates dehydration in the long run. But in that moment, the brain's survival reflex cared for no other logic. Then volunteers stepped forward. The river was visible from the hill. Down below, down a steep slope, 200 meters away. The Sioux warriors had that area completely locked down. Going down there was risking death, but the water was down there. Captain Benteen called for volunteers. 14 soldiers stepped forward. All are recorded by name. Among them were Corporal George Lell, Private Thomas W. Murray, and Private Neil Bancroft. They would carry canteens and buckets, descend to the river, fill them with water, and climb back up. That was the plan. The first group went down. The Sioux noticed. Fire rained down. The soldiers ran, slipped, tumbled. Those who reached the river plunged the buckets in. Filling them took 5 seconds. Climbing back up took 2 minutes. For those 2 minutes they were under heavy fire. Lel was hit in the leg. He fell, crawled forward. Someone else pulled him up. Murray was hit in the shoulder. He didn't even make it to the river. He turned back, but the water arrived. The buckets were mostly full. Was it mixed with blood? Maybe. It didn't matter. It was given to the wounded. Those who took the first sip closed their eyes. The delirium began to recede. This water run is recorded today in the annals of the Medal of Honor. 7 of the 14 soldiers who went down to the river that day received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States, not for fighting in a trench, but for filling water from a river. That alone was enough to describe the sheer desperation of the situation on the hill. At noon, the Sioux fire maintained its intensity. The snipers on the opposing ridges worked in shifts. A tired shooter was replaced by a fresh one. There was no such luxury on the American line. The exact same soldiers waited in the exact same trenches for hours. Eyes grew weary. Reflexes slowed. A soldier raised his head for no clear reason. Maybe a sound, maybe a reflex, maybe exhaustion. A bullet entered his temple and exited above his ear. The man slumped sideways. The man next to him pulled him down. Dr. Porter rushed over. There was nothing to be done. 4 miles south. There was still no sound. No one asked any more. Everyone knew, or they felt it. Nothing was coming from Custer's Valley. No gunfire, no signal, no messenger. The silence, this absolute emptiness, could only mean one thing. In the afternoon, Benteen looked east from the trench. There was no dust on the horizon. Reinforcements were not coming. General Terry's main forces theoretically should have been on their way. But when? Estimating the hours was impossible. 1 day or 2 days? Holding on at this pace for 2 more days. Benteen took account. Able-bodied soldiers around 190. Wounded 52. Ammunition at critical levels, though not yet depleted. Water insufficient, but a bare minimum could be procured. Defense tenable under current conditions. Tenable, but nothing else. The capacity for offensive movement was 0. The possibility of aiding Custer had closed long ago. The moment it closed was the moment Reno climbed the hill, or the moment Benteen read the call for help and failed to speed up, or the moment Weir was turned back. Whichever it was, the door had shut. The sun dipped lower. The firing continued. By the evening of June 26th on the hill, 53 men were dead or dying. In Custer's Valley, a different count had been taken. But those on the hill didn't know this yet. They would know. In the morning. Through the night, the sound of drums came from the Sioux camp, a victory ceremony. Uninterrupted, rhythmic, deep. The soldiers on the hill heard this sound. Those trying to sleep could not. The wounded mumbled in their delirium. Sentries stared into the darkness, guided by the sound of the drums. Everyone knew what the sound meant, but no one said it aloud. Torches burned that night in Custer's Valley. Sioux and Cheyenne warriors performed victory dances. This tradition, this ritual, this celebration carried over to the hill 4 miles away. When the wind blew from the right direction, the drum beats grew louder. The soldiers looked at one another. No one spoke. The very thing required to speak, hope, no longer existed on the hill that night. Morning, June 27th. Before the sun rose, something changed. The sound from the Sioux camp shifted. The drums stopped. Then came the sounds of horses, many horses, in motion. Then human voices, the sounds of tents being dragged, the grunts of pack animals. The sentries on the hill noticed this. Benteen was awakened. Was an attack coming? It was not. The Sioux and Cheyenne army was breaking camp and leaving. This decision had been made the previous night. Scouting reports had arrived indicating that American reinforcements were approaching from the north. The main American force under General Alfred Terry was on its way. The Sioux leadership decided that maintaining the siege of the hill no longer offered a tactical advantage. The victory had been won. Custer was annihilated. Reno and Benteen had been pinned down and dealt severe casualties. Continuing was pointless and, moreover, risky. The massive camp was packing up. The migration column stretched toward the southwest. Thousands of people, thousands of horses, hundreds of tents. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon. The soldiers on the hill watched. At first, no one fully understood what was happening. A trap? A feigned retreat? No one moved. No one went down. It was 8 in the morning. The dust cloud shrank on the horizon. It shrank further. It disappeared. Silence. A true, complete, absolute silence. No gunfire. No drums. No horses. Not even the wind was blowing at that moment. The soldiers on the hill stood frozen in their trenches. Then someone stood up. No one would shoot him. He was allowed to stand because there was no one left to shoot. Benteen gave the order. A scouting party went down. They swept the riverbank. They entered the campsite. The traces left by thousands of people were everywhere. Extinguished fire pits, food scraps, abandoned belongings. But there were no warriors. The camp was empty. Word was sent to Benteen. Everyone on the hill came down. They had been awake for 53 hours. For 53 hours there had been no water, no sleep, limited food. They went down to the river. They drank. They washed their faces. The wounded were carried down. That morning, the river water was probably the best water ever tasted in history for those men. At noon, a dust cloud appeared in the south. This time it was different. The American flag was spotted. General Alfred Terry's vanguard was approaching. The soldiers on the hill lit a signal fire. Terry's men slowed down, tried to assess the situation, and then advanced. Terry and Reno met. Terry looked at Reno. Reno's state alone told the story of a 53-hour siege. Terry asked where Custer was at that moment. Reno couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come out. An officer stepped in and explained. Terry sent a scouting party south to Custer's Valley. This scouting party returned an hour later. The officer stood before Terry. He tried to say something. He couldn't find the words. Terry spurred his horse and rode into the valley himself. What he saw entered the official reports. These reports were later released to the public. None of Custer's 210 men were alive. All of them, down to the last private, had died in the valley. The bodies were scattered over an area of about half a square mile. The soldiers had been cut off from each other, dying in small groups, some completely alone. This distribution told the story. The encirclement had been completed, the groups separated, and systematically annihilated one by one. Custer's body was there too. He had 2 bullet wounds, one in his left chest, one in his head. He had not been scalped. He had not been stripped. Some Sioux testimonies explain this as a mark of respect shown to Custer. Some scholars reject this interpretation. The absolute truth remains unknown. But the physical state was recorded in the archives. The general condition of the other corpses was different. Most of the soldiers had been scalped, stripped, and mutilated. This was a tradition of war. Mutilating the enemy's body meant rendering him powerless in the afterlife. Some bodies were in such poor condition that identification was impossible. Civilians and military personnel inspected the corpses, identifying acquaintances by clothing, a ring worn on a finger, or a patch of hair color. Terry remained in the valley for 7 hours. A count was made. 210 dead. No survivors, no prisoners. It was the heaviest cavalry defeat the army had ever seen. losing 210 men in the span of an hour. It was unparalleled in American military history. The burials began. The soldiers were buried partially. The ground was hard, there were no tools, and the bodies were in terrible condition. It was a shallow burial. Some officers were later exhumed by their families and relocated to eastern states. The enlisted men mostly stayed there. Custer, too, was initially buried there, but was later relocated to West Point. While all this was happening, Reno was on the hill writing his report. The report was written in standard military language, dry, technical, detached. How many men were lost, which positions were held, why they retreated. There was only one line about Custer. It stated that actions were taken in accordance with Custer's orders. Benteen wrote a separate report as well. The two didn't say the exact same thing, but neither told the whole story either. The contradictions were small but critical. Who stood where? When did the sound stop? Why didn't they go down? These questions reached Washington. The American public learned of Custer's defeat on July 4, 1876. While the centennial celebrations of independence were being held in Philadelphia, the telegrams arrived. The news was read aloud in the celebration squares. The shock was immense. Custer was a popular figure, a man of newspaper headlines, a heroic cavalry commander. Now he lay dead in a valley, along with all his men. The search for a culprit began, and the place to look for the culprit was obvious: Reno Hill. General Phil Sheridan launched an investigation. Internal Army correspondence was scrutinized. Testimonies of surviving officers were taken. The notes of the ammunition orderly were examined. The note written to Benteen: "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." Why was this note not taken seriously? Why did Benteen stop? Why did Reno retreat to the hill? Why was Weir turned back? The questions lined up, the answers were murky. In 1879, an official inquiry was opened. The Reno Court of Inquiry. It convened in Chicago. 23 witnesses were heard over 25 days. Testimonies were logged into the transcripts. A formal demand for charges against Reno was brought forward. Various officers testified that he commanded poorly that day, decided to retreat prematurely, and chose his own safety over aiding Custer. The court's verdict was announced. Reno was found not guilty. Officially, his actions did not conflict with military procedure. This verdict is still debated today because the records are clear. Benteen's note existed. Custer's gunfire was heard. Weir had advanced and then returned. Reno had been drinking. The chain of command had collapsed. These are undisputedly documented facts, but the Army needed something else. A hero's story. Custer was an American officer who fought against savage Indians, was defeated, but died an honorable death. This story made its way into the newspapers. Paintings were made. Statues were erected. Custer's last stand became a part of popular culture over the years. In the paintings, Custer was a figure, standing tall even at the final moment, sword in hand, facing off against a horde of enemies. The truth was different. In truth, 4 miles away, on a hill, 255 men were under siege. There was no water. No help came. 2 commanders were not officially charged. The Army documented its own failure and then closed the file. Benteen died in 1898 as a retired, respected, and decorated officer. Reno died in 1889. He had been dishonorably discharged from the Army for disciplinary offenses, though not related to Little Bighorn, but due to other charges. He died in financial ruin, in Washington, alone. Cities, schools, and parks bearing Custer's name still exist.